Hi everyone, it's me, Tim, and today I want to talk about tabletop RPG influences that directly show up in my own computer games. Specifically, I want to talk about experiences I had either as a DM or as a player that resulted in something going in my game. In fact, I'm going to answer the question from Mudmew4321, who asks, Hey Tim, I remember you talking about your super luck character from GURPS, which made you want to put luck into Fallout. Is there anything else in your CRPGs that was heavily influenced by your experience in tabletop games? This also goes for narratives that got told at the table and then put into your game. Thanks. I'm going to repeat a couple of them that appear in other videos just so they're all collected right here, but only a couple. So you're right, Mudmew. Dumb dialogue or luck in Fallout. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. Luck in Fallout was because I had played a really lucky character in Champion named Lucky Boy, who had all the levels of luck. He had extraordinary luck, ridiculous luck, super luck. And I had so much fun playing a character with pretty much no other power other than being lucky that I wanted to put that into Fallout because the game was so dark and so gruesome that the idea of something like this, a luck stat that was right there embedded in the system mechanics, was kind of my way of going, it's okay if things are a little silly. Not a lot, but a little. And then I'm going to say dumb dialogue, which is the other thing I've talked about, came from literally my original high school D&D campaign where I restricted a 3 intelligence fighter from using multi-syllable words. And that was directly the direct origin. I told that stories to narrative designers at Interplay. They thought it was funny. That's why there's dumb dialogue in Fallout and then tons of my subsequent games. But let me tell you some other things that happened. We used to play GURPS a lot during the Thursday night thing, which is the get-together we do every Thursday where anybody could come to the conference room and we just play games. And when we were playing GURPS, people liked to buy an advantage called Ally, or I think it was Ally Group, or I think actually it might be both. And what that said was an ally was an NPC with some skill. So it wasn't just a generic NPC who would come along to help you on adventures. And people bought that, and sometimes they'd leave it to me to invent the ally. And I'm like, sometimes I wanted them to invent the ally, but I found if I did that, sometimes the ally would be like this super powerful guy would show up. Sometimes I'd invent the ally. But in any case, Scott Benny loved that. And he was the one who made the Mysterious Stranger perk in Fallout, which was you'd get into combat and occasionally, it was a little luck dependent, Mysterious Stranger would show up and help you. In our earlier one, though, Mysterious Stranger could die. He didn't, in later Fallouts, in the Bethesda Fallouts, he would show up and do a horrible incapacitating shot that would almost always kill the enemy. In ours, it was just some guy would show up. I think he'd walk in from off screen and he'd take part in that combat. In Fallout 1, he hung around after combat too. And so we had to put a little conversation on him. But in Fallout 2, I think he ran off when combat ended. That's straight out of our GURPS tabletop play with allies. Another thing, and I know I told this story about they would frequently run away from encounters. When encounters looked like they were too hard, my players would have no trouble just running away. Sometimes leaving other players behind to suffer their fate. This running away from random encounters was something that went into the random encounters that we created in Fallout. They were expected to be all over the board. In fact, as you went farther northwest towards where that military base was, there were harder and harder encounters. We intended for you to run away. It was not something that was an emergent property. When we made those random encounter maps and we put those grids down, the expectation was if this is too hard, run away. Saw it a lot happen in my GURPS campaigns. Wanted people to do it in the Fallout game. So those are some influences on tabletop, on Fallout that I remember. Now let's jump to Arcanum. I know I talked about Judges Guild and how it influenced me. I just want to remind everybody, those big overland maps that Judges Guild provided for their Wilderlands campaign was a massive influence on me making Arcanum. I kept thinking of those big maps with just points of interest, not even well defined, like bunch of skeletons here. There's a tower here. Maybe there's a dungeon under it. Oh, there's a graveyard here. I wonder what's going on there. We would just plop these things down. That came straight from Judges Guild. And it was a very different thing than you saw in a lot of the TSR modules at the time, which was here is a map of a dungeon. And there might be a paragraph saying this dungeon is under a hill 2 miles northwest of some ill-defined village. Judges Guild loved to give detail, sometimes tiny, spotty details, sometimes heavily detailed. I mean, they sold modules like Modron and there were a lot of other villages you could buy where you could just Light Elf, the Spies of Light Elf, where here was an entire village defined with NPCs that had motivations and things they were trying to do. And these were set so that when there were dungeons nearby, you had somewhere to go to. Another thing that I got from a tabletop game, I'm going to show you that in a second. This is Torg. I have the box set. Torg was incredibly influential on fate points in Arcanum. We used to play Torg. I wasn't the DM. My friend John really loved this game. He got me and some other friends into it. We would play on the weekends. There was a point in there. I'm trying to remember what they called. Were they rift points? I forget what they were called. But they were the direct influence of fate points in Arcanum. Basically, they were things you could say, hey, GM, this is what I want to happen. And you could force a die roll to make it happen. So fate points were put in Arcanum so that players, if you've hadn't made a save in a while and things weren't going well, you could heal yourself or get a critical or make sure assure that a skill did work. I am going to pick that lock. I am going to disarm that trap. I just like things like that. It was a way, made Arcanum feel more like there was a DM you were playing with that you could interact with that way. And another big influence in Arcanum were cursed items. I loved cursed items in tabletop D&D, especially if there was something really good. Oh, but it had this penalty. And we put them into Arcanum because there were some cursed items in Arcanum that were actually really good, especially if you didn't care about the penalty. So this happened a lot in D&D where one of my characters would find a cursed item and would go, I could imagine not caring about that penalty. It makes people not like me. I don't care. There was I mentioned an artifact that a monk found in one of my games that meant he couldn't hold metal. But he was a monk. He attacked with his bare hands. And he wore leather breeches. I think he couldn't hold plant material either. He didn't care. He attacked with his fist. It didn't matter. So he found a way of making that cursed item into something awesome. Huge influence. I thought about cursed items from my D&D modules and Judges Guild modules a lot. In fact, there's an entire relic artifact section of the DM's Guide in first edition and a Judges Guild module of artifacts. And most of them carry some drawbacks, but really powerful abilities. Very influential on me. Now let's jump to Temple of Elemental Evil. The idea of party alignment in there, where you had to pick a party alignment and then everybody in the party, their alignment had to be within one step of that party alignment. That came from tabletop games I ran in high school, where it made absolutely no sense that maybe an assassin and a paladin were in the same party. It's like, why would the paladin even allow this? There were times where, you have a chaotic good player and a lawful evil character, and they're just going to get in arguments all the time. And saying, well, they're in the same party because players just didn't cut it. So I started instituting this idea of, hey, I think you guys all have to have alignments that are at least close to each other. And remember, there was that graph. And I said, it's without counting diagonals, it's one step. So people did that, and it worked. And so I put that into Temple of Elemental Evil. Similarly, the opening vignettes, we tied that to the party alignment, which was a new thing for Temple. But the idea for that came from my high school D&D campaigns where I didn't like giving people, here's your quest, go and do it. I tried to work them into things because I had a lot of modules that I made myself and TSR modules and Judges Guild modules. I would read them and then I'd remember they were there and I wouldn't place them anywhere in particular. And then when, as often happened, the players needed something, they needed to remove curse. Maybe they didn't want that cursed item anymore. Or they wanted a raised dead. Or they needed a favor from a noble. Something. Instead of saying, well, go do this quest for me, go wipe out this dungeon for me, something generic, you'd have the cleric go, I want this Mace of Disruption, and I know it's in that dungeon over there. Go get it for me. What was fun about that is it gave the dungeon adventure a goal, but it also meant that you could put in a powerful item like a Mace of Disruption, knowing that the players could use it for a while, but eventually they had to give it to the cleric that sent them. Often they'd reinforce that by casting Quest or Geas on them to make sure they brought it back. But that made me think, hey, Temple of Elemental Evil would make much more sense if you had an opening vignette that connected into it. One thing I remember doing is there was a treasure item that showed up on rolls. It was just, you find a treasure map. That was awesome. We used that for one of the opening vignettes. But I used that in my tabletop campaign to connect people to dungeons I had made that I didn't have set in a particular place. I just wanted to use it. I made a dungeon for fun. Great. I rolled up treasure map. Perfect. It's a treasure map to this dungeon. Also in Temple, and this wasn't received as well, but there were henchmen that would only come work for you and they took a chunk of XP, money, and items. The module, Temple Elemental Evil module, calls for that, and I used it. But I did that in my campaign too, because I found that if there were henchmen that my characters could get where they pay 100 gold and now they have these 0-level fighters that tromp along with them, they used them as meat shields. They treated them horribly. But if you wanted anybody a little better than that, I didn't want them to treat them like that. If they wanted a wizard because he had some spells or a priest for heals, I wanted them to treat them better. And I found that if they took a chunk of XP money items, that the players took them more seriously. Now, I know a lot of people in Temple didn't like that role. And people even talked about that before we shipped. And I said, well, then they don't have to take those people. But it was controversial, but I'm glad I put it in. And that did come from my tabletop. And then the final one, I don't remember if I talked about this before, but there is a random encounter in Temple with a bard named Z-Axis. He's the son of Y-Axis and X-Axis, and he's looking for his sister, imaginary axis, I-Axis, who is an illusionist and no one's seen her in years. But this is a real character. This is my brother's character sheet. That is a picture of Ricardo Montalban in Circus of the Stars, which is why he's wearing a onesie. He was doing circus acrobatics on a tram, up in the air. What was cool about this was this character always stuck with me. He was named Z-Axis Montalban because that's a picture of Ricardo Montalban. We had so much fun with that character. I think my brother got him up to like 7th level in Bard. Remember, you have to go through Fighter and Thief first. So it's a pretty powerful character. He shows up in Temple as a random encounter. And that's who it is. It's that character from my high school campaign. Later games of mine after Temple, there weren't a lot of tabletop influences, mainly because I had used my biggest ones already. And I wasn't playing tabletop as much. Starting with Vampire, and then later in my career, I didn't play as many tabletop RPGs. So I drew from other sources. But I hope, Mudmew, this answers your question about what other things happened on my tabletop RPGs that went into my computer RPGs.